And I believe we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young, and I'll send it over to Uta to start her introduction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Uta from Uta's International Lounge. And as you can see, we are still waiting for Richard Simcott to join us. And
no, we're not. No, we're not waiting. He's right here.
Hello.
We're not waiting. It's
Hi, Richard.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We just went live, and we're starting our introduction. But since you're here, we can start to introduce you, right? So for those of us joining, a good shout out to everybody on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Welcome to see today's session where we're going to pick the brains of one of the most famous polyglots in the world, I would say.
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, he has been named one of the most multilingual people in the UK by HarperCollins, but I'm going to extend that to the world. But he is what Goethe Institute calls the ambassador of languages. Definitely. I would even say he's a great supporter and advocate for rare languages, endangered languages, right, Richard? And he's also the founder of a big event called the Polyglot Conference, which is going to take place in actually about a month and a half from now. There's actually two events this time under the umbrella of Polyglot Conference. So definitely go check out polyglotconference.com, where you'll find an online event that's that's in early October, and the on-site event, which is going to take place in Cholula, Mexico. That's going to be fun. We're going to go down and have Viva Mexico in Cholula. So, but all these accomplishments, the guy's learned more than 50 languages. He can definitely communicate fluently in the great majority of those. All these accomplishments, I think, you can find on just Google Richard Simcott. You're going to find lots of information. But I want to introduce him a little bit from a personal perspective. Like the first time I saw Richard was way back in the early 2000s. I think I saw this guy on YouTube speaking a gazillion languages, and that really piqued my interest, and started following him since that. And the first time I actually met Richard in person was in New York in 2015 at the Polyglot Conference, the third event I think that they organized, and that literally just blew me away so much that I started an event of my own in Montreal called Langfest. Ever since, our sister events have been doing lots of collaborations together, and I'm very honored to be able to call Richard a friend. We are friends, right? Good. Good friends, collaborator, and Richard's just like the most approachable celebrity that you'll ever find, I think. Wow. Definitely. So there you go. That's my little introduction of Richard Simcott to all of you who may not know him, but I'm sure a lot of you do. Now I'm going to ask Richard to do a little introduction of your own, if you can beat that. I want to know about your involvement in the world of languages, how you got interested in this, and all of that.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the very kind words and for inviting me to be here to talk about my favorite topic, which is always a pleasure, obviously. So yeah, you're quite right. I quite like languages. I've enjoyed learning them for as long as I can remember, and whether it was different accents and dialects or languages that you could find in course books, I just used to like digging into them and getting familiar with different ways to express what was in my head to a new group of people, or to a group of people but on their terms. And that's always fascinated me. And I think as human beings, we have this innate desire to be part of groups. So we do tend to group together, and when we move to different places, we like to try and group together. And what you tend to find is if you don't learn the language, it's very difficult for that process to happen. Even in countries where people have a very good level in another auxiliary language that you could use, you find that the real connections start to happen more and more as you learn the local language, or even if you're learning together. Let me take an example. If you move to the beautiful area of my island of Great Britain, of Cornwall, you could learn Cornish, but okay, you might not be able to use it so much with local people because they don't speak it as widely as we hope they will in the future at the moment. But if you learn the language, and which people may say, and you get people who will say this about pretty much every language, why bother learning it? Well, the interest in learning it and getting involved in that linguistic community means that you start immediately handing out an olive branch to other people who have similar interests, who you can connect with in a way that's meaningful to them and to you. And you build these bridges together. So these friendships and these bridges that you build will just endure for many, many years, and if not your whole lifetime. And it sort of, from small acorns grow mighty oaks, as we say, right? So these even just interest in linguistic communities and starting that process is a really important first step. And so it's very, very true what Catalome said, the famous Hungarian polyglot, and she wrote in her book, a language is the only thing worth knowing, even poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. Even if you just know one word, it's better than knowing no words. It's not like you can know one word and it's really bad. It's always a positive. And that's kind of my philosophy in life. And this is why I also believe that championing and helping to redress the balance in the world, particularly for indigenous, endangered and vulnerable languages in our communities, is super important. And if we're a speaker of a language that is dominant in a society over other languages, sometimes we don't see why that's important. And all I would say is it's worth digging deeper to try and understand why that's important. Because seeing the world through another language and another culture, because language and culture are fairly well linked, the language is the vehicle for culture, and it's how we express certain things that are important to the culture. So learning about that is actually a really good way of seeing the world in a different light. And as soon as you start adding more and more ways of seeing the world, you find it easier to add more if you can do that already once, twice, or 3 times, because your brain is already prepared, and sort of the ground is already tilled and the seeds are sown for you to then grow additional languages in your brain. And so if ever anyone has any doubt, why is my child going to school and learning Welsh and not focusing just on German or French? Well, if they're in Wales and they have contact with that society, or if indeed you have contact with it in other means, maybe in Patagonia or another part of the world where you engender a positive environment for that language, it's always going to be a benefit for a child or for the individual as they grow up, because they'll see the world in a very different way than somebody who just grows up with one language. Or if they want to learn another language later, it's definitely a lot easier. So
fantastic. Well, since you've mentioned the children already, let's dig in then. Let's dig in about your family, how you raised your daughter with the different languages. Which languages, what kind of language dynamics do you have in your home?
So yeah, languages at home for me it was a given that we were going to speak more than one language, because my wife is Macedonian and I'm from the United Kingdom. And so it was clear that obviously my first language growing up was English. So English was going to be a language and Macedonian would be the other language. And my wife and I have never spoken English together. We've only ever spoken Macedonian. So that's actually an important thing in our family and how the dynamics work, because English is, and we have to recognize this, a dominant language in the world on a global scale. So if you speak a language like English that is a dominant language that's all over the internet, realistically, if then the other parent speaks English to the English speaker, it makes additional challenges. So me speaking Macedonian and learning Macedonian was extremely important for that process to work well with our daughter. Fortunately, we had already established Macedonian as a home language before she was born, but that language was there anyway, and that definitely helped in our language development as a family. But when we got to the age of 1, I decided that I was going to speak actually English and French from birth, and I tried. So I didn't try. I spoke both languages. I just switched, and my daughter couldn't really choose to listen or not listen. It was just there. It was. I just spoke, and I would sing the same nursery rhymes or similar nursery rhymes, or alternate traditional nursery rhymes from English and French, and I would say similar things in both languages. And because the languages sound quite different, children pick up on those sounds, and they can very quickly associate that they're 2 different languages. It's not that confusing. And I know that the idea is this traditional one parent, one language, but actually my inspiration for that was watching Welsh parents bringing up their children in Wales and hearing them code switch between English and Welsh, and the child could do perfectly fine in both languages. And so I knew that, okay, this isn't something that people often talk that much about, even in these circles, as a concept or an idea. And I don't even know how much that's researched, but just observing it myself growing up on the island, I saw it happening and I saw it worked. So I decided to implement the same thing, but I would use French. It's a language I felt very comfortable in. It's a language I realized that really helped me improve my English later in life. So it was a huge advantage for me at school when I was studying English literature to know French. So French and English were a given. But when we got to the age of 1 year, my daughter was already able to speak in all 3 languages and create sentences of 3 words. So we saw that she didn't have a problem with that. And the health worker came to do the usual checks and asked her to perform different tasks, draw a face and different things that she was asked to do, and to see if she was developing okay, if there were any issues. And spoke to her in English, and she said, "Wow, her English is really, really good." We were like, "Yeah," she said, "Yeah, it's more, it's above where we'd expect it to be at this age. So that's really good." And I said, "Oh, that's fantastic, because she's doing that in the other 2 languages too." And the health worker sort of looked and went, "What, she in other languages as well?" Yeah, well, we speak Macedonian and French too, and she kind of does that in all 3. So we sort of realized, okay, she could do this quite well and manage the languages fairly well. So my wife and I sat down and we looked at more research on what you needed to do as a bare minimum to introduce a language to a child. And we saw this research out of the US and Finland about an hour a day of a language, of interactive play with a child, is enough for that child to understand the language. So at the age of 16 months, we decided that we would introduce either German or Spanish, but we couldn't decide which one. So I said, I'll take an hour a day and play with her in both for an hour a day. And within 2 months, she actually started preferring words in German and Spanish over English, Macedonian, and French, which absolutely astounded us. And so we just carried on with that way of living in the family. And yeah, when she got to school age, we just let her carry on as normal. I didn't make her read or write necessarily in all of the languages. I didn't see any point in getting her to do all of her subjects in all of the languages. It was just enough for me to have the grammatical structures in place, to understand the language, and to be able to know what's going on. And once that is sewn in the head, you can't really get rid of that so easily. Whereas adding stress to it, I've always been of the opinion that I didn't grow up speaking, say, German or Macedonian, but it doesn't really handicap me in any way, in any measurable way for me personally, having not had it as a home language, because I use the language effectively. My life works. I've worked through languages like German, and it's not been an issue for me. So I couldn't really expect my daughter to do something I didn't do myself. And also, it's got to be fun, right?
Absolutely. There's a key word.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to pick your brain about these strategies, because when we talk with parents, and parents often say, well, there is this OPAL method that you were mentioning before, one person, one language, but there is also the minority language at home, or even 2 languages per parent. So I understand that you transmit 3 languages to your daughter, whereas your wife 1, right? So Macedonian, and you are English. You're at 4. Okay, now, yeah, because we have to come to 5 languages in the end, exactly.
Yeah.
But one thing that very often is pointed out, especially with very young children, you were mentioning she was 1 year old when you started introducing other languages, is to have them maybe have 1 person per language, right? A little bit like Tetsu is also doing with his children. I did it with mine as well, to have a babysitter, nanny, or an au pair or someone else in the daily environment of the child that provides a given language. But you were transmitting 2, 3, 4 languages in the end. How did you do this? Because in order not to mix them up, for example, we know we shouldn't mix them up.
Yeah.
Maybe have different situations where you speak given language. I don't know, maybe at breakfast German, and then how did you do this?
Okay, so absolutely, you're right that there was some order to this. It wasn't just me saying a word randomly in a language and switching every 5 seconds. I mean, that would drive me insane myself as an adult. If anybody comes up to me and just says a word in a different language every 5 seconds, that's not how language works usually.
No.
And unless you're in a very specific code switching community, as some of my friends have been in the past. I had friends from Switzerland who would code switch with Italian origin friends who spoke Italian at home and Swiss German on the streets, and they would start a sentence in one and end it in another. But that became a kind of a friend group as they'd already developed both languages. But as a child, you're quite right. You don't want to be sort of mixing them up because you don't have an idea of where the grammar starts and ends, or the words. It's just confusing. So to the age of 18 months at home, I would speak both languages, English and French, back to back, but not mixing them. So I'd have an area that it would turn into bath time would be in French, and then something else in English. But by the time she got to 18 months, she was actually saying quite a lot. And that's when I stopped speaking English at home, and I only spoke French. And she was speaking English at clubs and with other family members outside of the house, and friends, for example. She would be using English. We were living in the United Kingdom, so she could use English all the time and hear it all the time. So that wasn't an issue. With Spanish and German, I would take her to a play area outside of the house to do that. And so it was always associated with going to the place in one language, whether it was Spanish or German, and then we'd play, and then we'd swap languages there, and then we'd come back with the other language. The only time those other 2 languages would be present in the house were eventually at bath time, when we'd play music in them. So we would listen to songs in German, for example. I was an au pair in Germany, so I had all these German hits and songs and things. We used to play them then, and the good thing was that there were people who spoke those languages that I was connected to as well. So sometimes play sessions would take place with other people who spoke the language with me, so she'd hear me speaking it with another adult, and also other children who would be speaking it with their parents. So sometimes those play sessions would be combined. So that was the way we did it. Macedonian was just a constant because that was just the main language at the table. We'd sit down, and my daughter would actually, in the first 3 years, she very often just spoke to me in Macedonian, because that was the language Mum spoke to Daddy in. So she used to speak to me in Macedonian. So even at times when we were left on our own and my wife had to go somewhere or do something, she would speak to me in Macedonian. And this this was quite funny because, like you say, each child's different, right? So we don't know how they're going to react. So there are a few weird quirks, and it's also one of the reasons why it's important to learn, as one of the parents, the other language or languages that are being used. So I would understand the Macedonian. I would never correct her or say, don't speak Macedonian. In fact, I never actually called the language Macedonian. It was called Mummy's language. And I spoke Daddy's language. And languages. But and that is actually obviously a technique that you're aware of, that you can't reject Mummy's language or Daddy's language, but you can reject French, because it doesn't mean anything to the child. It's just a label that you can reject, like I don't like pears, or I don't like broccoli, I don't like French. I don't like Mummy's language or Daddy's language is a harder thing to reject as a child. And it's an easier thing to ask, how would Mummy say that? How would Daddy say that? Anyway, she would speak like her mum in Macedonian, and I would just understand it and reply in French from the age of 18 months, obviously. So I've got these videos from when she was younger, and we'll often watch them together, and she'll be speaking to me in Macedonian, and I will be replying in French and asking questions in French. And it's quite funny to sort of hear, and people, like family members who've seen those videos, they're like, what's going on? And it's quite funny. But then you'd hear, I have other videos where she's like, will be at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother would be speaking to her in English, and she will speak English to my grandmother and then Macedonian to me, and then I'd be speaking French to her.
Yes, that's amazing. And I think what happened to you happened to some other families who have multiple languages as well, where then at some point maybe the children find out which is the family language or the emotional language also among the parents, and they want to be part of this. I just had it with several parents who said, well, why are they responding in the language that we are speaking among us, the parents? There were the third language actually that they chose, but still the children wanted to learn this language in order to be present or be somehow included in this relationship that the parents had among them. And they saw also that they were very, they liked each other. So it's a love language somehow that the children then want to really prefer to other languages, etc. Which leads me to the next question. I hope that's okay if I just insert another question. Is this preference towards these languages? You said at that age she preferred, or she tendentially used more Macedonian. Did this change over the time? I imagine yes, that there were some shifts. Because
there was a very definite shift. So at the age of 3, this is why I say I know very clearly it was like 3 years old. And she just had this realization that Daddy spoke these other languages, and one day stopped speaking to Macedonian. It was like almost overnight. And I remember where I was when it happened, and it was quite we were in Prague, and we were in Prague for the summer, and she just stopped speaking to me in Macedonian. And if I spoke, we went from a situation where she used to translate for my mum. When my mum spoke to me in English, she'd stop her grandma, and then she'd say, "Wait, Daddy," and then she'd translate into Macedonian what my mum had said. Even though she could hear me speaking English back to my mum, we went from that situation to Daddy doesn't now. We don't speak to Daddy in Macedonian, and she was just using English and French mostly, but she would also use some German and Spanish. And she questioned over the years as well. Like she sat me down when she was 4, and she looked at me. She goes, "Daddy, why do we speak Spanish?" and I just said, "Well, because we can." And I said, when you're older and you go to school, you will have to learn a language. And like every child will have to learn a language at school. I said, and it might well be Spanish. I said, but you will have the advantage that you'll already know a lot what the other kids have to learn. And you'll be able to focus on whatever you were to do, whatever you want to do. You can have more time to play. You can have more time to sort of on a child's level, you know.
Yes.
She just looked at me and she went, "Clever daddy."
I'm
Clever indeed.
very clever. I have a bit of provocative question now. Sorry if I do this, but you are mentioning now for the Spanish. If now the language would have been, or if you were, let's say, speaking to her in Swiss German, yeah, you don't live in Swiss German part of Switzerland, and she would ask, why do we need to speak Swiss German? Because that's, for example, not a language that is taught in any school outside of Switzerland or in a Swiss, yeah. So would you have replied the same thing?
I am, well, probably not the same thing. It's difficult for me to put myself in the place of
The
a Swiss
situation.
German speaker, but I can definitely do that. For example, with other languages that I speak that are not necessarily taught. Macedonian in the UK is not taught at school, so
Yes.
obviously mum speaks it and family
Yeah.
speak it in
Yeah.
the Macedonian family speak Macedonian. The important thing is, I think, if you're choosing a language for home, clearly it's going to have a tie in some way to the family. I mean, it's quite random to sort of inject a language that's zero relevance to anyone in the family unit. It would be quite random for me to just start speaking Swahili, for example. Not that I can do that, but I mean, my Swahili is very basic. But let's take that as an example. That's old Swiss German, as you said.
Yes.
I think then what I would say is, well, we've got this special, we got friends and family and connections to this place. We go there on holiday. Remember when we went and we did this? Do you remember how they spoke and how they said things? And I think I would again call on the emotions of this and say, because there are ties, right? There are ties to this. So if you're teaching your child Swiss German, you're teaching your child Swiss German for a very particular reason.
Absolutely, yes. And I think this is where I wanted to have you, because all the languages that you are transmitting to you were transmitting and still transmitting to your daughter, you have a special tie to them. And there is a reason, because there is either mommy or daddy who speak it and who have this emotional somehow bond, if we want to talk about that, or there is a societal reason you need to use it, because when we go there and visit family, you need to be able to communicate. Absolutely. So that, I think, is also a very, very important message to other parents who are maybe thinking, oh, well, I speak, let's say, 6 languages, and I would like to learn myself, let's say, Chinese, but they don't have ties to it. They are still learners as well, and the children are very young. So I think there is somehow a difference. I don't want to talk about hierarchy, but some kind of hierarchy there is in terms of need to know the language, right? So if it would be now a language that is not part of your daily life or your family, extended family, and where you spend your holidays in, then you would put that language at the end of the row. Or
it definitely, I agree with you that, I mean, as unpleasant as it is to sort of hear that kind of thing about, language, the connection of languages, we'd like to think that everything's equal, and definitely in a way they should be equal. But we're talking about families and we're talking about personal relationships, and let's be honest, a child is part of that family unit, and a child will pick up very, very quickly if that is a genuine link or not. Children are very in tune with the dynamics and the feelings within the family unit, and they know and they pick up on very quickly how people react, even outside of the family unit, how as a society people react to the language, and that can also impact on how you teach them languages too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Richard, has it been hunky-dory the whole time, raising your daughter in 5 languages? There must have been different challenges and obstacles that came up, and how did you solve those?
Yeah, I mean, look, ups and downs, obviously. there are hard choices to be made as well, because I mean, your child starts school, and it's one thing when your child's up to the age of, say, 10, 11, it's one thing. But once they start high school and they've got serious learning to do, and they have exams that count towards their lives, you know, as a parent, we have to be realistic. I mean, what are we actually teaching the children the languages for? And have we got expectations on the children that they perform at the same level in all languages? Because if we have, then I think we need to let go of that very quickly. Unfortunately, I have seen a lot of that in these international environments where I want my child to be able to do everything they do in one language in all 2, 3, 4 languages. Like, wow, when does the child get to play? When do you get to do anything? What you know, are you going to go through all of the stuff every time? And how boring will that be? And how much resistance will you get later on? Because social aspects and all that other kind of stuff, they're all also important. The other question that you have as well is, when you choose a multilingual education, there are choices you make, and those choices come with consequences. The consequences of a multilingual education are that if you do certain subjects only in one language and not in another, then as an adult, are you likely to revisit that later? Will you understand any connotations in the first language relating to that subject later on? Is it something you're likely to go back to and return? Will you feel that there's a hole in your vocabulary and in your knowledge? Will it make you feel insecure? The thing is, every child is different, like every adult is different. We grow into individual human beings. So there's not one rule for this. There's not, this works. It's what works for you as a family and what works for the children. And are we looking after the benefit, you know, the sort of the well-being of the child? And so for my own personal choice, what we did is my daughter did kindergarten in French to the age of 6. So I switched back to English at home, and then she went to school in English, and I switched back to French at home from 6 onwards. But when she started high school, I wanted to make sure that, particularly for English, it was she could already speak the other languages. And for me, it didn't matter anymore. The code switching was no longer an issue because we could code switch and she already knew the different languages. So for me, the important thing was actually making sure her English was on par with other first language English speakers around the world. And to do that, I had to, because she had access to a first language English speaker at home. And if I didn't help her in English with those things, I don't think that would have been fair to translate all of her homework and then try and explain it. And it would have been a crazy thing. So there have been hard decisions that you say, okay, well, I'm going to speak English more than before, particularly with literature, with helping with English is a very rich language and vocabulary. And what I found is that the French and Spanish have actually really, and German even, have helped with her understanding of English, as I suspected and sort of realized that would be the case. That has been the case. And so what I've seen as she's reached her teenage years, that her understanding of English literature, instead of having to worry about the learning of the words, and she's had some help with that from me as well, but it's actually also been super powered by this background in French and Spanish and German.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, hard decisions, but generally speaking, I've got to be honest, my daughter's questioned it a few times only, and I've not had those. I have had the sort of, when she was very small, obviously, a couple of times she said, say it in English or say it in French, not in German, or particularly German and Spanish were the ones that she'd question, because they were the ones that we only used for an hour a day, right? Or later, even half an hour a day sometimes, depending on the schedule. But what I would say, and as a true manipulator of a parent, I would say, well, in German, what a shame that you don't know what that is in German, because I was going to get you a present. And it was funny because then she'd say, Wie, Papa? Was war's? And she'd say it, and then she'd speak German. But this is, look, the kids, they play with manipulation, they play with this thing, and they learn. certain things in society. Fortunately, I've not done that so much. But when I needed to, it's worked very well. Instead of like having an argument or a debate about it, it's like, what a shame, because I was going to take you and do this. But I knew she understood. So it wasn't that she didn't understand. She was testing the boundaries. And you've got to learn the difference between child manipulation as general rule. Obviously, I'm not advocating, but these kinds of small manipulations, when children are testing the boundaries themselves, are quite useful, because we as adults make decisions for our children based on a much wider view of the world and what this knowledge means than a child the age of 5, 6, 7, even 12. They can't make the decision in the same way because they haven't experienced the world in the same way, and they don't know what our end game is. And as adults, sometimes we sort of second guess and put our own goals and our own ideas and our own ideals onto children, and we can't, because a child's going to always follow the easiest path to communication in a family environment. So that's where that testing the boundaries came from. It was easier to say the things that you wanted to say, of course, in Macedonian, English, or French. But we know that's not the point. But try and explain that to a 5-year-old. The only way you can do that is, what a shame, I was going to buy you some chocolates.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Sorry.
So if we sort of lead directly into your daughter, then now you're talking from the parent's perspective, but put yourself in her shoes. Let's say hypothetically, what do you think she would say if we asked her, what do you feel about being raised multilingual? Did you like it? Is this has it been great? And today, I mean, she's a teenager now. Does she make conscious efforts to maintain her languages on her own? That kind of stuff. What do you think?
So yeah, I mean, she's so I guess some of the tests for me, the litmus test to see whether or not this has been a success or not, were when she was 10, she actually asked to be put forward for exams in all 3 languages, not English and Macedonian, but the other 3, French, Spanish, and German. And she was studying them at school. And so she was very proud that she spoke
nice.
Nice. And the highest level she could sit was an A2 for children, because obviously you don't have the ability at the maturity to speak on the topics at B1 and B2 levels. And she passed all 3. And so she got awarded certificates for all 3 exams at school. She was extremely proud of that, and so that was one good indicator that this was a good thing. She was also using them online, so she would play games sometimes with children and online in a safe environment, obviously. But she would sometimes meet children who spoke Spanish, and she would play in Spanish, or she'd use French at school with other children that spoke French, or and she asks for she's not doing German at the moment at school, she's just doing Spanish, but she asked for additional lessons in German to practice writing and to know those.
Great.
So yeah, she actively, I think she appreciates that she speaks and understands 5 languages. And
I think we shouldn't underestimate the pressure or the influence of peers and of some environments with our children. I had exactly the same kind of experience with my children there also. If a certain friend likes a certain language, they put more effort into it, and they're very proud to already speak it and maybe read it and write it, and they can give them some books or play a game together in that language. So that are amazing things that can happen. So she is making this conscious effort of maintaining her languages now, and she has some preferences about the languages that she can put more effort in. But you certainly have planted the seeds for her to now take care of them later on. I would like to acknowledge, first of all, those who are following us. That's Chiara Seminerio and Konstantinos Spanoudakis. And I would like to share some questions I have or remarks, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Konstantinos, that was the first question. High questions. Let's suppose your Greek 2-year-old comes from German kindergarten at home in Berlin and says to you, Bal, what do you do? And he continues, A, you repeat Bal to support the effort. B, you're corrected to please fill in the gap because I can't really read so well Greek. Or you say, yes, Bal, that's also called in a different way in Greek. Or D, something else. Thank you, Richard. By the way, we've met in Ljubljana.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much for the question. I think, is there an easy way to answer this?
No.
And be perfect? No. So if you say Bal back, depending on, this is why it's really important, depending on the child, that can be a victory for the child. I've got dad to speak the language. So we've got to be very careful. The other thing is we don't want to also chastise a child for speaking a language. They're making an effort for communication. And so pretending we don't understand, for example, which I've seen happen as well, I don't think is a sensible thing to do either, because that destroys integrity in terms of the child will look at us and think, well, of course they understand it because they speak the language, if they hear us speaking it with other people. So I would possibly say in Greek, and daddy calls that, and then you use your word. And that's probably where I would go with this, because I can't think of another way that in most situations it would work 90% of the time. It's never going to be perfect. But that's just one strategy where you're actually not using any of the things I think that you've said, but you are acknowledging that they said something, you're giving, and daddy says it like this, and you're adding to it. So you're kind of giving a tacit, yes, well done, and daddy says it this way. Not a but. It's important. It's not a but. It's an and.
Yeah, it's a amazing answer to this. That's not a but an and. You add to it. You don't subtract or you don't eliminate one of the parts of the equation, right? There's another question from Chiara. What is your most frequently used language to date and why? To date, here is a language you are comfortable with and why. I don't know now, Chiara, if you intend this for Richard or for his daughter. So maybe you can answer this question for both of you.
Okay, so I would say that for my daughter, her English and Macedonian would be her strongest languages. We've never lived in France and we've never lived in Germany or Spain. So clearly, just on a sort of a living experience level, not being in those media sort of environments and things like that, hearing it constantly on the street, that plays a role. Okay, so and schooling is in English, so English and Macedonian would definitely be the two strongest languages, and they would be her preference, I would say. Although sometimes if she speaks to me on the phone, she'll often speak to me in French. So she still likes French. She says it's awful to read and write. She likes to speak it. And I completely agree with her. It's an awful language to write. Most French people can't write it properly, so all of those accents.
Agree.
But for me personally, the language I use the most, I would say probably is, Macedonian would be the language I would use most often, because it's the language that I use at home.
Okay.
Fantastic. So thank you to all the questions, and thank you for everybody who's watching live right now. But do know that this video will stay on these 3 platforms: YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, in perpetuity. So be careful with what you say. We're always careful with what we say. Alrighty. So how we're doing with time and how we're doing with the questions?
We have a few. We have more time, and I would like maybe to ask you a question that Yoshito Darmon Shimamori asked in the Facebook group. He can't follow us live because he's in Japan at the moment, so the timing was not the best for him. But he wanted to ask you, what would you advise parents who are not polyglot or not multilingual, and who cannot dedicate so much time to language learning if they want to get better in a language in order to be more confident in passing on to their children, so as additional languages.
Wow, that's a very big question.
It is.
I don't know if we have enough time to answer that fully. I would say that first of all, finding your own way of learning and rhythm and integrating whichever language that is into your life is probably point one. And that sounds like point one, but there are many, many points under that point one that you have to recognize why you're doing it, your motivations, your goals, your objectives, how you're going to do it, the materials, how you're going to use it, and then how you're going to incorporate that language into your life, because that's what we have to do with language. It's not like just reading sort of anything else. A language is a living thing that's spoken and used, and so the way to really fly with it and to have it as a meaningful part really of your life is that it's incorporated into your existence. And I think the languages that you use at home, definitely that's important to have that. When it comes to with a child though, and if you don't speak another language, then there's absolutely no reason why you can't take it on as I'm going to learn this with my child, interact, have that as a fun time that you do with your kid. Start learning a language, watch things like Peppa Pig, Pocoyo, or whatever it is online in the language. Ask questions about it, repeat the words with the child, and learn it with your child. Make it. The important thing is the interactivity.
Yeah.
And so if you make it interactive, your child will learn and you will learn. And so you'll see the things over and over again. Unfortunately, when you're doing this with a child, you have plenty of time. And the kid doesn't care if you get it wrong. In fact, they're going to get it wrong many, many times themselves. And you'll get it right together eventually. So I'll go back to the quote that I said in the very beginning of Catalan. A language is the only thing worth knowing, even poorly.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if I may add something, because we were talking about children, and somehow when you gave your answer now, I pictured young children, but we can do this also with older children, right? You can do it with children also when they are in their 20s and they want to learn a new language, and you are just a sparring partner, and you can try to enunciate or to articulate new sounds and things. So something that can be, it's really fun also with teenagers, and it can be a nice project together. It's something that I personally enjoy very much. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
A natural sort of extension, I think, from this question. I mean, it's written out right now on the screen as monolingual parents wanting to raise multilingual kids. But do you think there's like a really, really significant, if any, significant advantage for a polyglot or a multilingual parent to raise multilingual kids? What do you think?
Is there an advantage? Well, I mean,
a distinctive advantage. I mean, obviously, the fact that you have another language as a resource, I understand that part. But other than that, I don't know, conceptually or.
Look, I think if you're teaching something and you've already been through the process yourself, you're often aware of a lot of things, and also you can explain things through the language. So let me give you an example. When I was teaching my daughter German, I never sort of, I mean, I started telling her words like ball and things like that, of course, but I didn't tone down my grammar with her. So I would say things that would be taught, sort of A level in the UK, sort of the end of school, these kind of advanced structures in German, and but they're normal things that you say in a German family, but they're advanced for a learner as a second language. And it's amazing how quickly they get used to those structures, and the child can automatically understand them because the parent understands them. So there definitely is that advantage for sure, because I mean, I can't pretend that, in terms of basic words and phrases, of course, there may not be much of a difference. But when it comes to quite complex structures and using maybe irregular verb forms in a very fluid manner, the child gets used to hearing them over and over again from you. and because you know them and recognize them and can use them yourself in the same fluid way, it's normalized. Whereas I think if you're learning it very much as a second language with your child, it is learning it as a second language with your child. Whereas the way I did it is very much teaching it almost as a first language.
Mhm. Yes, and I wonder also, and I saw this also in some groups on Instagram who are talking about transmitting a language that the parents are still learning themselves, that there is some kind of resistance of the children at some point if they say, oh, it takes so long until mom or dad, whoever it is, finds the word, or they have to look them up in a dictionary, and then that's something that stops a little bit this curiosity and the flow also of the learning, right? So that can be somehow hindering maybe at some point. This is one thing that I see that might be more difficult for someone who is still learning the language from the beginning.
Yeah, and by the same token, I've met people who have taught their children languages that they themselves learned, and children quite often also will speak it, strangely, with better pronunciation and more and closer to the accent of someone from the country where the language is spoken than the parent, which is also, I mean, I saw that once in Poland, and I was like, wow, okay, that's impressive, because you're built. It's almost like the standing on giants thing, right? You know, where your parent gives you that base, and the child then just extends that further forward.
Yeah,
because they don't have to work all those years and be conscious about the effort to put in to get the base right. They just start from here already. And so even with people who are learning the language, it depends on where they are on the journey. Obviously, there can be frustrations, of course, and I can completely understand where that would come from. At the same time, it's, as I say, it's better than nothing. The only thing I would say with caution is if you're in a country where still, unfortunately, they advocate immigrant parents learn it speaking the national language of the country they've moved to over the home language or languages, that's where I have a slight problem with that, because I think, unfortunately, that sort of incorrect advice that the child will not learn the national languages is quite dangerous, and potentially also for the child quite damaging for reconnecting with original cultures and family members and friends and contacts from other countries of origin. So yes, speaking another language is good, but also we've got to remember our roots as well.
Definitely. I do have, I guess, one other aspect I think that all of us language learners who are passionate about languages that we have to be careful with is that not all kids are passionate, or in fact I would say a very, very small fraction of those are naturally inclined to liking languages. So as adults, we shouldn't, for one thing, enforce our own interest and passion onto the kids. And what you do is great. You let them be. If they want to speak, they speak. You just create the environment that sort of leads them to speak it if they want to. But oftentimes, like you said, there are parents who want them to speak 3, 4, 5 languages to the same level, all the languages written and all that. That's sort of where it's really gone too far into just sort of imposing your worldviews on the kids.
Yeah, and I mean, even that, I mean, I'm gonna just add a caveat and say, even though that's not me, there are children that potentially would like that. I mean, there are children that seem to be quite happy to be learning lots and lots of things, or the same things in different languages, and learning different scripts and all that different stuff. So, I mean, even with that, even though I said that and you agree and I agree with you, generally speaking, I don't think there's ever 100% this works and this is right for everyone.
Absolutely.
And this is the really key thing. I think
that's absolute.
we always need to I mean, I get that I started this by saying we like to identify with groups of people, and in society we do that very often. We base that on all sorts of different factors as well, which groups we belong to. In reality, we're all quite different individuals, and just because we look or speak or act or have certain preferences in life doesn't necessarily mean we fit exactly that mold. And so when children are born, it's a similar thing. We just don't know until they're older, and they probably don't know for a long time either. I mean, it probably takes us to about 26 for us to be really fully formed human beings. Let's be honest. 18 and 21 is way too young. We're still finding out about ourselves, our relationships, interactions. We're still having huge dramas, and to learn all the things about the world and dynamics. And we're still learning a lot up to the age of, I'd say, about 26. I know that was true for me. I don't know how it is for everyone else in the call or listening, but when it comes to a child, I absolutely think that yes, as adults, we have our interests, we have the things that we like, and as parents, it's natural that we share that with our loved ones. It's very natural. And so for me, it's languages. So I shared my languages with my daughter, but that's where it stops. And now she is, I trust her to make her own decisions and to have her own interests and likes, and she will make the decisions about what she wants to do on her own as a strong, independent woman, and move forward with whatever she wants to do. And I will support her whatever she decides to do. So the languages are just something that she can take, leave, have on the back burner, whatever she wants to do with them. She's got them, and that's it.
Yes.
All right. Well, what a way to bring it all, I guess, to close the loop, so to speak, on Richard Simcott's philosophies on raising multilingual kids, taking his daughter as a case study. Now, what's the long-term sort of vision that you have for the language world, whether it's for kids or for parents or for just language lovers in general?
I'd like to see us supporting more the endangered, indigenous, and vulnerable languages of the world, and trying to help people to see their value. Why? It's not a choice. This sort of choice that we put. Well, why do that when you can do this? Why study Nahuatl when you can study German? Well, why can't you do both? Why can't you have both? If your community already speaks it, and it doesn't cost anything, you just learn it. You've got Nahuatl Spanish, and then you can study German. No one's stopping you studying German, but you can do all of them. It's not an either or in many cases. And often, I think for these communities in particular, what it's made into is almost an either or. And it's made into a reject and lose and move forward with this other thing that's seen as more prestigious, seen as more useful, seen as more economically viable, beneficial. And I understand the societal motivations behind these things, but we need to dismantle them because they are a relic of our colonial past, and we need to move beyond that and understand that there's an intrinsic value for the well-being of communities and individuals within those communities. We do not know whether our child will grow up to be somebody who looks Black and is retrospective on history, on anthropology, on where their origins are, or whether they will be the sort of person who doesn't care and just moves forward with whatever language they have. There are both types and even more types in between of that kind of child that can be born. We don't know what our child will be like. And so it's best to not cut off opportunities, but to expand opportunities and horizons.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Richard, one last thing I'm going to ask you to do is to remind us about the Polyglot conference that's coming up in October. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so speaking about Nahuatl, we're going to be going to Cholula in Mexico on the 28th to 30th of October, and we'll be there for the weekend for the Polyglot Conference. The week before, we're going to be running with Zoloa languages. Courses in Nahuatl and Spanish for anybody interested. So if you're interested in coming to Spain, to Mexico and learning Spanish or Nahuatl, then please do. The polyglotconference.com website is there on the screen. You can get tickets now. And for the start of October, from the 1st to the 9th, we're going to have an online version, which isn't an online version as in an online version of this conference. It's a global conference, which means that because it's online, we can do different things, and it means we can have people there who wouldn't normally be able to travel for various reasons and be represented, and we can just enjoy breaking bread and enjoy each other's company, learning lots of things, people speaking on different topics at both events, people giving workshops, teaching languages, practicing languages, getting to speak to each other, whether you speak one language or a gazillion and one languages, doesn't matter. You're all welcome. All you need is an interesting language. That's it.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you for taking time out of your super hectic schedule. Anything to add, Ute, about all this?
No, I think we close it nicely with also the view on the Polyglot Conference and what you said about where the world is heading. It's very spot on. I hope that many are listening, and I'm also very, very happy that it doesn't come from someone who speaks a minoritized language across the world as a first language, but by someone who speaks one of the most dominant languages across the world, which is also something that I think can be used in order to make more pressure to maintain the endangered languages, which I completely stand behind and I support. Thank you very much, Richard, for being our guest today and for taking this time and talk with us and answer some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to everybody watching on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Our next guest will in 1 month, and once again, the third Tuesday of every month, except next time it'll be in the morning since our guest will be from Japan, and we'll be announcing that in due time. So look forward to that. Meanwhile, get ready for school. All right, bye-bye now. Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Ciao, alla prossima.
Ciao, ciao.